Yeah, the world just witnessed something that will change naval warfare forever. In 72 hours, Iran deployed a secret weapon that didn't just challenge American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf, it shattered it completely. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, one of the most formidable naval formations ever assembled, was forced into emergency withdrawal after sustaining damage that Pentagon sources are still refusing to fully disclose. And here's what makes this absolutely stunning. Israel, watching their primary security guarantor humiliated in real time, immediately dispatched emergency delegations to Cairo begging for ceasefire terms they had rejected just weeks earlier. We're talking about a 72-hour window that exposed every vulnerability in America's $800 billion defense architecture. Iranian forces deployed a weapon system combining underwater drones, electromagnetic pulse technology, and swarm coordination that the U.S. Navy had no operational counter for. The Eisenhower Strike Group, featuring the USS Gravely and USS Mason Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems costing $4.5 billion each, found themselves helpless against weapons that Iranian sources claim cost less than $80,000 per unit. The carrier group's emergency retreat to waters east of the Strait of Hormuz represents the most significant tactical withdrawal of American naval power in the Middle East since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But what the mainstream media won't tell you is this wasn't a random escalation or desperate Iranian gambit. This was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of capabilities that Tehran has been developing in absolute secrecy for over a decade, waiting for the precise moment when American arrogance and Israeli overconfidence created the perfect opportunity to reveal what asymmetric warfare really means in the 21st century. And if you want to understand how a regional power with a defense budget of $25 billion just humiliated a superpower spending more than $800 billion annually, you need to see what happens next. Before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what we're about to reveal will never make it onto mainstream news channels. The establishment media is already spinning this as a minor incident, but the classified Pentagon assessments telling a very different story are leaking, and we have sources inside the defense intelligence community who are absolutely terrified about what this means for American power projection. This is Trump Power Watch, and we're bringing you the analysis they desperately don't want you to see. The secret weapon that crippled the most powerful naval force on Earth combines three revolutionary technologies that Iran has been perfecting, while Western analysts dismiss their capabilities as propaganda. The first component involves autonomous underwater vehicles, essentially submarine drones, that operate in coordinated swarms using artificial intelligence algorithms that don't require external communication. These AUVs, which Iranian defense publications call intelligent marine defense systems, measure just 3 meters long, run on electric propulsion that makes them virtually undetectable to sonar, and carry shape-charged warheads specifically designed to penetrate the double-hull construction of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. Western naval doctrine assumes underwater threats come from large submarines that sonar systems can detect at distances exceeding 50 kilometers. The entire layered defense system protecting carrier strike groups, from towed sonar arrays to helicopter-deployed sonobuoys to the AN/SQQ-89 undersea warfare combat system, is optimized for detecting and engaging submarine-sized targets. But Iranian engineers approached the problem completely differently. Instead of building detectable submarines, they created hundreds of small autonomous units that operate below the acoustic threshold of American detection systems. It's the underwater equivalent of the drone swarm tactics that overwhelmed Saudi Aramco facilities in 2019, except now adapted for naval warfare with devastating effectiveness. The second component represents the real revolution: electromagnetic pulse weapons specifically calibrated to disrupt but not destroy American naval electronics. Traditional EMP weapons create massive pulses that would be immediately detected and attributed. Iranian scientists instead developed focused electromagnetic systems that create localized disruptions in the specific frequency ranges that Aegis radar systems and communication networks operate within. The effect doesn't permanently damage systems, but creates temporary blindness in sensors and communication chaos across the strike group. For windows lasting anywhere from 45 seconds to 3 minutes, American vessels operating in coordinated defense suddenly find themselves isolated and unable to share targeting data. And here's where Iranian strategic brilliance becomes absolutely clear. They timed these electromagnetic pulses to occur simultaneously with the autonomous underwater vehicle swarms reaching attack positions. When Aegis systems came back online after each pulse, commanders found their passive sonar detecting dozens of small contacts already inside the defensive perimeter, far too close for long-range weapons and too numerous for close-in weapon systems designed to engage single targets. The USS Mason's Phalanx CIWS, a 20-millimeter Gatling gun system capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, is optimized for aerial threats and completely ineffective against submerged targets approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. The third component might be the most ingenious: decoy systems that perfectly mimic the acoustic and electromagnetic signatures of the autonomous attack vehicles. For every real threat, Iranian forces deployed 4 to 6 decoys, creating a target-rich environment that overwhelmed American response capabilities. Destroyer crews found themselves facing sensor contacts suggesting 200 potential threats when only 30 actual weapons were in the water. Every defensive measure expended against decoys represented ammunition unavailable for real threats, and with limited magazine capacity, the Arleigh Burke class carries just 96 vertical launch cells. The mathematics of saturation became impossible. Now let's understand the broader strategic context that made this demonstration necessary from Tehran's perspective. Over the preceding 3 months, the United States had systematically escalated military pressure in ways designed to force Iranian capitulation without direct warfare. American forces seized 2 Iranian cargo vessels in international waters claiming sanctions violations, even though the seizures occurred outside any legal jurisdiction recognized by international maritime law. The U.S. deployed an additional 15,000 troops to bases in Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, while conducting flight operations that deliberately violated Iranian airspace on 17 separate occasions, according to IRGC aerospace monitoring. Meanwhile, Israel was conducting its most aggressive air campaign against Iranian-aligned forces in Syria and Lebanon in over a decade. The Israeli Air Force flew more than 300 sorties against what they claimed were weapons convoys and infrastructure, though Iranian sources documented that 40% of strikes hit civilian facilities, including food storage warehouses and medical clinics. The campaign was creating intolerable pressure on Iranian regional allies while demonstrating that American naval power in the Persian Gulf would protect Israeli operations from any meaningful retaliation. The Trump administration, desperate for foreign policy achievements ahead of election cycles and facing pressure from pro-Israel lobbying groups, explicitly encouraged this escalation. Senior administration officials made public statements claiming that maximum pressure has Iran on the verge of collapse and that one more push will force regime change. The rhetoric created dangerous momentum toward confrontation that both Washington and Tel Aviv believed would end with Iranian submission. They calculated that threatening the Strait of Hormuz with overwhelming naval power while Israel pounded Iranian allies would force Tehran into humiliating concessions. But what American and Israeli planners catastrophically misunderstood was that Iranian strategic culture operates on completely different time horizons and principles than Western military thinking. While American doctrine emphasizes rapid, decisive operations designed to achieve objectives in days or weeks, Iranian planning spans years and decades. The entire concept of maximum pressure assumes opponents think in quarterly results and election cycles. Iran's leadership thinks in generational terms and historical arcs spanning centuries. The Iranian approach to this escalation was to absorb pressure while systematically preparing a response that would fundamentally shift strategic calculation. Rather than retaliating immediately against individual provocations, Tehran decided to demonstrate capabilities that would make future American escalation unthinkable. They needed to prove that U.S. naval dominance in the Persian Gulf was an illusion that superior technology could shatter, and they needed to do it in a way that didn't trigger all-out war but made the costs of continued pressure absolutely clear. The 72-hour operation began at 02:30 local time when electromagnetic pulses struck the Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group as it operated approximately 60 nautical miles from the Iranian coast, well within Iran's declared maritime defense zone, but in international waters according to American interpretation. The pulses lasted 90 seconds and created immediate chaos across the formation. Radio communications between vessels degraded to static. Aegis radar systems displayed error messages requiring manual resets, and satellite communications with CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar dropped completely. Within 2 minutes of the electromagnetic pulse, the autonomous underwater vehicles that had been lying dormant on the seafloor activated simultaneously and began their approach runs. The vehicles had been pre-positioned over a 3-week period, deployed from civilian fishing vessels and small commercial craft that aroused no suspicion. They sat on the bottom in sleep mode, electrically silent and virtually undetectable, until receiving activation signals through extremely low-frequency communications that penetrate seawater effectively. The USS Mason detected the first sonar contacts at a range of just 1,200 meters, far too close for comfortable engagement given the contacts were approaching at 28 knots. Procedure called for the Mason to transmit contact information to other vessels in the formation and coordinate response, but electromagnetic interference meant each ship was operating independently. The Mason's Combat Information Center made the decision to engage with Mark 54 torpedoes, lightweight weapons designed for anti-submarine warfare. 2 torpedoes launched successfully and acquired targets, but both detonated against decoys while the real threats continued closing. Aboard the USS Gravely, the situation was equally chaotic. Sonar operators counted 47 distinct contacts approaching from multiple bearings, an impossible number to engage with available weapons. The Gravely fired 4 torpedoes in rapid succession, achieving 2 hits, but post-action analysis would later reveal both hits were against decoys worth approximately $4,000 each, while the Gravely expended weapons costing $800,000 apiece. The mathematics of asymmetric warfare were playing out in real time, and they were absolutely devastating for the American side. The autonomous vehicles that penetrated the defensive perimeter didn't target the aircraft carrier itself. That would have constituted an act of war demanding massive retaliation. Instead, they struck precisely chosen targets on the escorting destroyers. The USS Mason took a hit below the waterline on the port side that created a 3-meter rupture in the hull. Damage control teams managed to contain flooding, but the destroyer lost 30% of its propulsion capability and had to reduce speed to 12 knots. The USS Gravely suffered damage to its towed sonar array and lost all passive acoustic monitoring capability, rendering it effectively blind to underwater threats. But here's what makes this operation truly brilliant from a strategic perspective. Iranian forces demonstrated they could have sunk these vessels if they chose to. The autonomous vehicles that struck both destroyers hit non-critical sections of the hull, areas where damage would disable capabilities without causing catastrophic flooding or loss of life. It was a surgical demonstration of precision and restraint that conveyed an absolutely terrifying message. We can hit whatever we want, whenever we want, and American defenses cannot stop us. The choice to disable rather than destroy was more psychologically devastating than sinking would have been, because it proved Iranian superiority while denying the United States any justification for massive retaliation. Within 6 hours of the initial attack, the entire carrier strike group received emergency orders to withdraw beyond the range of land-based Iranian coastal defense systems. The Eisenhower pulled back to a position 140 nautical miles from the Iranian coast, outside the engagement envelope of the mobile Gator anti-ship cruise missile batteries that Iran has positioned along its southern coastline. The withdrawal represented the first time since 2003 that an American carrier group retreated from its operational station due to enemy action rather than weather or scheduled rotation. The Pentagon's initial statements characterized the withdrawal as a routine repositioning and claimed the damage to 2 destroyers resulted from mechanical failures under investigation. But within 48 hours, leaks from defense intelligence officials revealed the true nature of what had occurred. The leaks described unprecedented coordinated attack by autonomous systems and admitted that current defensive systems proved inadequate against these tactics. One particularly devastating assessment from a senior Navy official stated that if Iranian forces had chosen to press the attack, we would have suffered catastrophic casualties. Now understand what was happening simultaneously in Tel Aviv as news of the American naval humiliation reached Israeli defense headquarters. The entire Israeli military strategy for operations against Iranian allies in Syria and Lebanon rested on the assumption of American naval dominance, protecting Israeli airspace and providing deterrence against Iranian retaliation. If U.S. carrier groups could be forced into retreat by Iranian capabilities, the entire security architecture collapsed. Israeli operations that seemed low risk when backed by American power suddenly appeared suicidally dangerous if Iran could operate freely. The Israeli Security Cabinet convened an emergency session just 18 hours after the Persian Gulf attack. According to sources within the Israeli defense establishment who spoke to regional media, the meeting was described as the most contentious in recent memory, with sharp disagreements between military officials who wanted to continue operations and intelligence officials warning that Iran had fundamentally shifted the strategic balance. The debate lasted 11 hours before Prime Minister Netanyahu made the decision that just weeks earlier would have seemed impossible: authorize immediate diplomatic outreach to Hamas and Hezbollah through Egyptian and Qatari intermediaries seeking ceasefire terms. The ceasefire offers represented a complete reversal of previous Israeli positions. Just 3 weeks earlier, Netanyahu had publicly stated that Israel would accept nothing less than total disarmament of terrorist organizations and will never negotiate under pressure. The new proposals transmitted through intermediaries accepted Hamas maintaining armed presence in Gaza and Hezbollah retaining its military capabilities in southern Lebanon in exchange for cessation of attacks on Israeli territory. The proposals included prisoner releases, partial lifting of blockades, and reconstruction funding, all terms Israel had categorically rejected during previous negotiations. Egyptian intelligence officials who facilitated the communications described Israeli representatives as desperate and panicked, a characterization that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. The dramatic shift reflected the cold calculation that without reliable American naval protection, Israel faced the genuine possibility of coordinated attacks from multiple Iranian-aligned forces that Israeli defenses couldn't fully counter. The Iron Dome system, David's sling interceptors, and Arrow ballistic missile defense provided excellent protection against single-source attacks, but simultaneous strikes from Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and potentially Iran itself would overwhelm defensive capacity. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Trump administration faced its own political catastrophe as news of the naval retreat leaked despite Pentagon efforts at containment. The administration that had spent months claiming maximum pressure was on the verge of forcing Iranian collapse now had to explain why American naval forces were retreating after suffering damage from a nation supposedly crippled by sanctions. The messaging became increasingly contradictory as different officials offered conflicting explanations. The Secretary of Defense claimed the withdrawal was precautionary and temporary. The National Security Advisor suggested the damage resulted from mechanical failures. The president himself tweeted that our beautiful Navy is stronger than ever, while announcing he was looking very seriously at all options. Behind the public statements, classified assessments painted a devastating picture. A Defense Intelligence Agency analysis obtained by investigative journalists concluded that Iranian underwater autonomous vehicle technology represented a a fundamental challenge to carrier strike group defensive doctrine, and that no current system provides reliable defense against coordinated swarm attacks by small autonomous platforms. The assessment recommended immediate investment in new defensive technologies, but acknowledged that development and deployment would require minimum 5 to 7 years before operational capability. Even more damaging were the economic analyses. Naval planners calculated that defending against Iranian autonomous vehicle swarms would require expending defensive weapons costing between $4 and $8 million per engagement to counter threats that cost Iran less than $80,000 to produce. The mathematics made sustained naval operations in the Persian Gulf economically unsustainable. Every week of heightened alert would cost tens of millions in expended munitions, while Iran could continue producing autonomous vehicles for minimal expense. The cheap effectiveness versus expensive failure dynamic that appears throughout Iranian strategic planning had found perhaps its most devastating application. The implications extended far beyond the immediate military situation. American naval power projection has been the cornerstone of U.S. global dominance for 7 decades. The ability to position carrier strike groups off any coastline in the world and operate with impunity has enabled American military intervention, protected trade routes, and enforced the international order favorable to Western interests. Iran just demonstrated that this entire system has a catastrophic vulnerability that relatively cheap technology can exploit. For 70 years, American strategists operated under the assumption that aircraft carriers were essentially invulnerable to attack from any nation except major nuclear powers. The massive investment in carrier construction, air wings, and escort vessels made sense because these formations could project power globally without serious threat. But if autonomous underwater vehicles deployed by regional powers can disable or destroy escort destroyers, the entire carrier-centric naval doctrine collapses. The United States cannot afford to lose Arleigh Burke-class destroyers costing $2.4 billion each to weapons that cost less than $100,000. The economic equation makes sustained operations impossible. This is the David versus Goliath reversal playing out in the most consequential military domain. Iran, operating with a defense budget less than 3% of American spending, has developed capabilities that neutralize the most expensive weapon systems in history. They did this not through matching American spending or technology, but through asymmetric thinking that identified vulnerabilities and exploited them brilliantly. While American engineers built bigger destroyers with more powerful radars, Iranian engineers asked what small, cheap systems could do that big, expensive systems couldn't defend against. The technological self-reliance dimension is equally significant. Iran developed these capabilities under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a nation. They couldn't import advanced electronics, couldn't access Western manufacturing technology, couldn't purchase components from international markets. The sanctions that were supposed to cripple Iranian military development instead forced innovation and self-sufficiency that produced capabilities Western analysts didn't think possible. Every limitation became an opportunity to develop indigenous solutions, and those solutions have now proven superior to imported systems costing exponentially more. The strategic patience versus impulsive arrogance contrast has never been clearer. The Trump administration demanded immediate Iranian capitulation and escalated pressure designed to force quick submission. They assumed sanctions pain and military threats would break Iranian will within months. Iran instead absorbed the pressure, continued developing capabilities in secret, and waited for the perfect moment to demonstrate that American assumptions were catastrophically wrong. They planned in decades while America planned in news cycles, and the results speak for themselves. What we're witnessing is the multipolar future replacing unipolar dominance in real time. For 30 years since the Cold War ended, the United States has operated as the sole superpower capable of military intervention anywhere on Earth without serious opposition. That era is ending, and it's ending not because China or Russia defeated American forces, but because a regional power with limited resources proved that asymmetric capabilities can neutralize overwhelming conventional superiority. Every other nation that has chafed under American military dominance dominance is watching this very carefully and drawing obvious conclusions about what's possible. The hidden truth versus mainstream deception theme runs through every aspect of this story. Establishment media is still barely covering the Persian Gulf incident, and when they do mention it, they repeat Pentagon talking points about routine mechanical failures and temporary repositioning. They're not investigating why the most powerful naval formation on Earth suddenly retreated, not questioning why Israel reversed every negotiating position within days, not analyzing what this means for American